Welcome to the first episode of Cities in Motion, a three-part podcast series exploring urban mobility in a time of transformation. I'm your host, Sandra Shalsata, and this podcast is brought to you by TomTalks and Smart Cities Dive. Cities in America and around the world are grappling with a host of challenges and opportunities, from the lingering impacts of COVID-19 to downtown business districts to the rise of remote work. City leaders increasingly understand that they must rethink everything from economic development to urban mobility. In this episode, we are going to deep dive into a topic I'm sure most of our audience has heard about: congestion pricing in New York City. We are going to discuss the origins of congestion pricing, how long it has taken to make it a reality in New York, how well it's working, and its prospects given the Trump administration's efforts to end it. I'm joined today by Frank Douma, transportation policy researcher at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and Andy Marchand, traffic expert at TomTalks. Thank you, Frank and Andy, for being with us today.
Yeah. Hi, Sandra. Hey, Frank.
Hi, Andy. Hi, Sandra. Thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Great. So there's been a lot of attention focused on New York's congestion pricing in the past few months. But before we talk about New York City in specific, Frank, can you tell us more about when and where congestion pricing first got started?
Sure. Congestion pricing came out of the academic realm of economics and behavioral economics in particular. First developed in the 1950s, 1960s, where some economists perceived that what was happening on our developing highway system was that demand, that is, people driving, was exceeding the supply or capacity that was available on the roadways. And typically an economic response when supply is less than demand is that the price increases. So the suggestion was, if we could put a higher price in terms of actual dollars rather than what people were paying in terms of time and congestion, you could actually get rid of that congestion by having people pay a premium to be able to drive at those congested times. This first was implemented in Singapore in the 1970s, 1980s, and then began to be implemented in other cities, London and Stockholm most notably, in the 1990s into the 2000s, and that has probably been where it's been most noted as a success since then.
You've already mentioned some other cities like Singapore, London, and Stockholm who are doing things like the congestion pricing that New York City is now doing. How well has congestion pricing worked in these places, Singapore, London, and Stockholm in specific?
In terms of being able to control traffic, very, very well. In Singapore, that has been the standard for many years, as I mentioned. The difference in Singapore is that when the government of Singapore says that somebody is allowed to pay to have access to the congested areas, that is what happens. London and Stockholm became more interesting as that's a place where those are places where they're democracies and something has to be popular. It has to be showing to work in order to stay implemented. And that has been the case in both of those cities. In Stockholm, they had an interesting approach where rather than taking a referendum before they implemented, they decided to do so after implementation. The scheme was not seen as popular at the time of implementation, but after it was implemented and it came time for the referendum, it was passed with popular support. In London, it proceeded in a very interesting manner in that the nearly socialist mayor of London was the champion of this, but he was able to get support from the conservative national government by pointing out that this was actually the market at work and just using simple supply and demand processes where it would not cost the government a significant amount of money, whereas increasing transportation capacity out of their general revenues certainly would have done so. Instead, it became a source of revenue that was then reinvested into transit in downtown London. And therefore, in addition to removing the traffic congestion, which sped up transit, it gave better transit facilities so people were able to get a better alternative mode than driving themselves and a more reliable trip regardless of their mode choice.
So Andy, TomTom released its 14th annual traffic index this year, looking at how traffic is changing in different parts of the world. What is the data telling us about how successful these measures have been in these countries?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think Frank has a lot more maybe historical knowledge than I do on some of these. But London, knowing it very well and, being a UK national, I can tell you it isn't popular still today. There's still people who absolutely detest the charging zone. I think it's had a value, of course. It's certainly reduced the traffic, but then London always features kind of pretty high up on our ranking of the worst cities to drive. I think London has something like an average of 9 miles per hour through the center of the city in peak times, which is pretty slow. And for anyone who's ever driven in London, it's painful. It's not an enjoyable experience. So surely the congestion charging had an effect and has certainly persuaded people maybe not to drive as much in the city. However, London has always had an amazing public transport network with the underground network. So what I would say for London is they've also, since that, they brought in the emission zones, which I think is another ring, if you will, of a charging zone. It aligns a little bit with the congestion zone, but it does go much further and much wider beyond that. So there are a number of different things. I think the difficulty with somewhere like London, and I think this is probably different to Singapore, is it's really down to the individual to make the payment after they've entered that zone. So there isn't the system like in the US, you can buy these little, when you get your car, you have these little tag devices on the windscreen that automatically charge your account and recognize when you've driven through them. That's not something that London employed. And really, you're caught on camera. You then either have an account set up with with a credit card that charges, or you have to make payment before the end of the day on that particular day. Otherwise, you get subsequent fines. So I think certainly over time, you can see it has a difference. However, as I say, London continues to be heavily congested and the road infrastructure is a little bit limited in terms of what the opportunities are to change that and to increase the capacity for cars within the city centre.
So we're going to head back to the US now, and people in the US will be familiar with HOV lanes and other efforts to tackle congestion. Frank, can you tell us, what is the basic idea behind congestion pricing? How are similar programs around the globe designed and implemented from start to finish?
Right. So congestion pricing tackles really the origin of the demand for use of the facility. Basically makes it more expensive in terms of money spent to be able to access that limited supply. Something like an HOV lane is an attempt to create an incentive through a faster trip because fewer cars are coming through. But in that case, people do not necessarily see the direct connection between their action and an improved result. In congestion pricing, you can set the price in a way that limits the demand to the point of maintaining free flow on that facility so that if somebody pays the toll, they expect and they receive a faster trip versus basically trying to be a good citizen by deciding to take transit or an HOV lane and not necessarily knowing what that impact is on the overall flow of the system.
Frank, do you find that cities that have HOV lanes have higher rates of congestion? Because my experience driving in the US, you often see these HOV lanes. They're not always very busy with cars, but then that's one lane that's taken away from that highway or that road, which is kind of one lane less for all the other cars to drive in. So do you think that it maybe brings additional congestion by having those?
I don't think that necessarily creates more congestion. And in most cases, the HOV lanes have been added lanes, but rather than making them open to general traffic, they have been restricted to high occupancy vehicles. In other cases, the restriction only happens during peak periods, the time of highest demand, as a way to, again, create an incentive for people to change their behavior. But in both of those cases, you're correct. It has not been seen that there has been enough demand just for HOVs to really fill up those lanes. And so a response has been another form of pricing, which is to allow single occupant vehicles to pay a toll to have access to those lanes. So they become high occupancy toll or hot lanes. And again, in most cases now we see that price of that toll varies with congestion so that that lane remains free flowing.
So we're now finally going to look at New York City in specific. And New York has been trying to implement congestion pricing for years. What were the roadblocks and what finally made it possible to move forward?
New York has always been a place that is a good candidate for congestion pricing, given that it always had very high demand for use of its transportation system, and congestion has been a traditional problem. And also, Manhattan itself is got great boundaries of which you can price because it is an island, and so access is, in many cases, by bridges or tunnels that you can easily begin to control the flow or implement a price on. The hampers have usually been politics or politically based. The first attempts in the 1970s were in response to the air pollution in New York. It was ordered to take many actions to try to clean up the air in the 1970s. But by the 1980s, the city was judged to be in compliance with those restrictions before they ever implemented congestion pricing. And so that kind of hammer from the federal government was taken away. The politics was not really there for trying to alleviate congestion at the time through any sort of pricing scheme. It came back again in the 2000s as Mayor Bloomberg looked to congestion pricing as a way to increase revenue to transit and other improvements in New York City. But while he was able to get support within the city for the idea, it still required state-level agreement and was not able to get the necessary support in the state legislature. Finally, about 10 years later, in 2017, Governor Cuomo came back and supported the idea this time. And so that created the necessary state-level support to begin to move forward to implement the program. A few leadership changes, both at the city and state level, occurred since then. But by 2023, the federal government also gave its approval for implementing the program, and the support finally came together. It had one more, if you will, hiccup in 2024 as Governor Hochul suspended implementation for several months approaching the November election because, as has been the case in most places where people can vote, there was not popular support for the idea before it was implemented. So she put it on hold, but after the election, it moved forward again and began on January of 2025.
And can you tell us a little bit more about how New York's congestion pricing program was designed? What are the goals? And specifically, how was the pricing developed? How did the government come up with those figures?
So the design for congestion pricing is that it's implemented around the central business district in lower or southern Manhattan. If you will, 3/4 of the access is through bridges or tunnels, and then they drew a line across the northern part of the district. And the tolls are administered electronically at all of those access points. As designed, it was set up to charge a $15 toll for vehicles entering the zone. Part of the politics as it was implemented after the election is Governor Hochul came back and said, we're going to start it at $9 rather than $15 and see if that still has the desired effects. Otherwise, that has been the plan. There are certain restrictions and exclusions and categories for folks who drive for a living, like Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, taxi drivers, delivery truck drivers. They get a different treatment so that they don't have to pay $9 every time they enter the zone. There are also programs to handle people of limited financial means.
The $9 or the $15 is every trip. It's not for a daily rate then. So if I come in twice, I pay twice. Is that how it works?
That is correct to my understanding. There is also an off-peak rate, which happens between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. on weekdays, and then from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. on weekends. And that is just $2.25. Trucks and buses pay depending upon their size and function. Taxis and for-hire vehicles pay a different toll that is based upon the passengers. And the app-based Lyft and Uber pay $1.50. Taxis and black cars, that is limousines, are 75 cents per trip. So I think that's probably a decent summary at this time before I get too far into the weeds of how it's applied. Essentially, yes, there are contingencies for people who would come in more than just once a day or a couple of times a day.
I think maybe that's, Sandra, I think maybe that's one of the big differences in London, for example. What you pay is per day. So it's per 24-hour period. So yeah, if you go in and out of the zone, then you don't pay again. I think they still implement the off-peak and peak times. But as I said earlier, they've also now implemented in London, and many cities in the UK and across Europe now are now implementing these rather than congestion zones, emission zones. Obviously, emissions is a much bigger topic in Europe, hot topic in Europe. So definitely you find that vehicles are getting charged more now, but based on the emissions, obviously the goal to get older vehicles off the road, get more electric vehicles, etc.
So we're clearly seeing a difference between the way it's being implemented in New York and in London. And Frank, you've gone into the weeds, as you said, or you really went into detail about how the program is being implemented. But more importantly, what technologies are necessary to enable cities like New York to come up with these plans or these congestion pricing programs?
Yeah, so technology has definitely evolved and been a key part in the evolution and implementation of congestion pricing around the world. In Singapore, when it was first implemented, those who would pay the charge basically paid the charge and received a sticker that law enforcement officer would be standing at the edge of the border and look for that sticker, and they would seek to pull over anybody who tried to enter without the sticker, but the sticker showed you had paid. With the use of cameras and so forth, as Andy mentioned earlier, the ability to impose a charge in real time based upon whether one has a transponder or simply reading the license plate allows for much lower cost implementation and higher compliance with the schemes as that works forward. And in New York, as I understand it, it is cameras taking pictures of license plates so that they can be able to charge everybody who does come in.
Now going to you, Andy. TomTom works with a lot of city authorities who are looking at better ways to manage traffic. How essential would you say is data in implementing these kinds of measures?
I think it's key, really, because what we find in a number of locations is we can provide data that's evidential, that helps build the need, the use case, the business case, the funding, etc., for a lot of these schemes. Because otherwise, how do you actually measure accurately what the volumes are and then track them over time so you can see, is it having a value, is it having a benefit? Because pricing is really challenging. If you don't make the pricing high enough that it becomes something that puts people off driving, then it's really just becomes like another form of taxation. And if it costs you no more than a Starbucks coffee a day, maybe it isn't the deterrent that's needed. However, if you make it too high, then you're going to have this huge backlash from the public, etc. So having data there really helps a lot of these cities take the initial decisions and be able to, prove to those that have to fund these schemes or sign off on these schemes that, we're the city and we've got a problem with traffic and congestion, and we can see why we've got the problem. We can see where the problem exists, and now we need to do something about it. And I think by having the data, they can then start to model, almost creating like a digital twin of that city and saying, hey, if we implement this, this is the expectation. And then over time, again, using data, you can measure that. So, we've been able to look already in the beginning of this year and see a noticeable shift in the volume of cars in New York, especially during those commuter hours, first thing in the morning and in the evening. And it is noticeable. And we're continuing to monitor that through the year to make sure it isn't just at the beginning, people are a little bit shocked of having to pay, but then they get used to it and they come back again. Let's see what happens over time. But yeah, early indications would show that actually it is having an impact and it is having an effect.
And how about you, Frank? How successful would you say the New York congestion pricing has been?
Yeah, as Andy mentions, it seems to have accomplished the goals that were stated. We are seeing fewer cars coming into the congestion zone, which has resulted in facilitating better traffic flow. Speeds are increased. Trip times are down, while at the same time it's creating an additional revenue stream for the transit organization, the MTA, which operates as the buses and so forth throughout Lower Manhattan. So in many of those cases, what you were looking for to have happen when you implement the congestion toll has indeed taken place.
So now we're seeing the Trump administration opposing the New York's congestion pricing efforts. Frank, can you tell us a little bit more about why that is and what the legal status of the program is now?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, in late 2024, before the Trump administration returned in January, things were put back in place. In 2023, the federal government had given its approval that this is a scheme that could be implemented in New York. As we've discussed, it wasn't necessarily a popular scheme, indeed so unpopular that Governor Hochul felt that she needed to suspend implementation until after the election. They moved forward anyway after the election. The Trump administration recognized that there was an opportunity here politically to show that they were more responsive to the desires of the people of New York than the governor and the city of New York. And so they declared that they were pulling the federal government's approval. And so therefore, congestion pricing in New York had to stop. The response from the MTA, backed by the city and the state, was that this is not an approval that could be revoked or pulled back. It was simply a matter to check a box that the scheme met various requirements, and the federal government did not articulate how anything had changed on that since the administration had changed. So it was something that the federal government did not have the authority to rescind. The MTA also sued the federal government to say that the federal government indeed did not have the authority to remove their approval, and that therefore congestion pricing was legally implemented. I understand in the last several days actually have now sought an injunction against the federal government to both against removing their approval, but the federal government has tried to withhold other federal funds coming to New York until the congestion pricing is removed. And the city has also said that the federal government cannot do that because that is a different issue. These are funds that were approved by Congress for different purposes, not related to congestion pricing, and the president's administration does not have the authority to withhold those funds that were approved by Congress.
So Frank, what lessons can other American cities draw from New York's experience?
Well, I think most American cities are going to wait until the court cases work their way out. There's the ruling on the injunction that may be expected at any time, but the otherwise hearings have been set for later in the summer and into the fall. So until that time, we will probably not see any American cities move forward with that. But over time, I think a number of cities that are experiencing congestion issues, looking at New York, may see that this is a tool they could deploy. New York, again, has a more favorable geography, with Manhattan being surrounded by largely by water, and otherwise a relatively small geographic footprint to be able to implement cameras. Some of the other older cities in the United States have similarly compact downtowns, so they could choose to try to implement what we call a cordon system, drawing a line around a certain area, as we see in New York and also in London. But there also are opportunities to implement pricing in other ways. As we mentioned, the HOT, the high occupancy toll facilities, are in a number of U.S. cities now, and being able to toll certain facilities, not just for those who want to use the HOV lane, but for all users to come through in order to maintain free flow conditions on otherwise crowded facilities would be something that I think could be looked at. I just returned from Boston where they've got the Big Dig, and that has worked well for a number of reasons, but it also is a very physically limited facility. And so I could imagine, and this is not coming out of any official notes from Boston, but as demand increases on that it could be a tool to implement congestion pricing on the Big Dig in order to maintain free flow through there, as well as possibly create revenues for expanding it if that were ever necessary.
So, Frank, what you're saying is cities are going to wait and see what happens in New York City before making their next move. But overall, what would you say is the future of congestion pricing in the U.S.?
I think that presuming that New York ultimately prevails in the court case and congestion pricing remains, it will become another tool that cities will look at in their toolbox for being able to maintain free flow conditions throughout their city. It will not necessarily become the next big thing, but as cities consider options for increasing transit, for creating other additional capacity, they may continue to look at the opportunity to raise funds through tolling one way or another in order to move forward and both maintain and expand their transportation systems.
I would just add to that as well that I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from outside the US as well. As Frank mentioned a couple of times, Manhattan is quite unique. It's an island. You have to come either by bridge or by tunnel, and there's one way in and out really. So it's much easier to control. I think when you get cities where you have to draw an imaginary line and paint on the road that you're now entering a zone and put cameras up, there's the opportunity for people to do kind of workarounds and take side roads that skirt the edge of the zone. I think that then creates more congestion on smaller roads. So what I would say is I think congestion zoning is a tool, as Frank says, but I think it has to be maybe thought about alongside other things. I mean, you could, for example, make the car parking inside the so-called zone higher and just outside the zone lower. So again, it encourages people, hey, if I don't drive all the way in, if I park a little bit further out, it's going to cost me much less to park my car. Maybe that's another thing. It seems to be at the moment that the idea of congestion zones is kind of more stick. And I think we need to look at some of the carrot options as well that encourage people maybe not to drive and not penalize those who do have to drive.
If I can just follow back up on that, I think that tends to be the essential part of implementing any sort of some pricing scheme, is that you provide very clear discussion of what the benefits, what are those carrots, whether it's increased funding and increased capacity in transit, or more reliable trips or faster trips or things like that, those are the pieces that need to be articulated rather than just simply making people pay for a trip that they used to not have to pay for.
Now, before we close, Frank, Andy, thank you so much for joining us. If we have listeners who'd like to find you and learn more about your work, where can they do that?
Fortunately, my last name is fairly uncommon, so a simple Google search for Frank Douma tends to get both my pages at the Humphrey School, which is hhh.umn.edu, and at the University's Center for Transportation Studies, which is cts.umn.edu. Both pop up quite quickly. Those have more information about me, as well as a link to my email address and so forth.
Andy?
Yeah, I think if people want to know more about what TomTom's doing in this space, simple tomtom.com will get you to the right place where you can find more information. And if you want to take a look at our traffic index, our annual report on more than 500 cities across the globe, just add a /traffic index to the tomtom.com. That'll get you there quite easily.
And that's it for today. Thank you, Frank and Andy, for sharing your time and insights. And thanks to our audience for joining us. Our next episode will take us to LA, a city built for the automobile that is trying to improve how its citizens get to work, school, and the many events that make LA such a great place to live. The episode will focus specifically on how the 2028 Olympics is an opportunity to reimagine urban mobility in LA. We hope you'll join us. Until then, take care.